Good afternoon. So yes, the Medidata story starts at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. The title of my talk is, What's the Next Experiment? I still wake up in the morning, and when I'm in the bathroom, I see over my head the subtitle says scientist. And I think that that's a really interesting way to approach business, and it is exactly how our company started. So about 25 years ago, I didn't have an office, I didn't have a desk, I had a lab bench. And behind the lab bench was a freezer stuffed full of tubes of human blood. They were from patients who had prostate cancer. And my job was to take all that blood and do a whole bunch of assays and see if we could do a better job in the lab of figuring out who was going to suffer from their prostate cancer than people who weren't. And we don't have to go into all the science, just it was a pretty good idea. What we do need to talk about is the fact that Columbia, full of so many great professors, right? I'm not a student, but I can still kiss their ass. Columbia is a place where we had a lot of impressive people, including my department chairman at the time, who was the head not just of our department, but of the biggest urological surgery organization on planet Earth. So as soon as we started publishing how great this assay was, that I was stuffing notebooks full of reams of results for, and using Excel spreadsheets to track patients for, and keeping all my data in a 386 PC with a cathode ray tube, so I'm old too, in the back of the lab to manage, this became something that everybody wanted to collaborate with us on. I'm a scientist. I really like science as a thing, but I do think that the laws of gravity are different at an academic medical center. Shit rolls downhill faster there than anywhere else on Earth, and therefore the need to run this giant collaborative project on this particular cancer assay fell to me at the feet of the totem pole of the scientific part of the hospital. And of course, I think this is actually a great kind of exclamation point on what Haley said earlier in the last segment. I might put a little bit of a question mark on this idea of whether or not bouncing around between different industries is such a good idea with this as well. There I was with this huge problem, realizing that science plus technology could help us reinvent the way we thought about doing human research. And I began discussing this idea with my benchmate. I'm sure many of you have worked in a chemistry lab or a biology lab, even if it was just in high school. There's somebody that you stare at all day. And the person I was staring at was training to do their training as a medical resident at the hospital. And while I was running all this academic research, he was working with giant pharmaceutical companies and biotech startups that were trying to cure cancer. And so if I was the science bottom foot of the totem pole of medicine, he was the medical bottom foot of that totem pole. And he was like me, into computers. We were kind of nerdy, and we talked about this idea. This is 25 years ago. This is before the internet was a thing, that we should try to do research online. We don't have all good ideas. We've had terrible ideas over the years, but that actually turned out to be a pretty good idea and was the beginning of us not just reinventing the way research was done, but reinventing us as people and reinventing what we do every day. We wound up developing this idea for a while in like 1999, and I think this puts a great exclamation point on how you need to think about diversity in people. We told our great idea to somebody who seemed like a god to us back then. He was about to become an attending physician. If you know anything about the medical centers, he was a fellow at the time. He was like, we looked up at him on the totem pole of medicine. He was like the Shin. But he wound up giving us a great piece of advice. He looked at us and he said, well, this idea is terrible. Like, what do you mean? This is a great idea. We're going to use the internet. We're going to do research. We're going to connect all the doctors and the patients and all the nurses and all the statisticians at every life sciences company in the world. And he said, no, I love the idea. But you know about science and you know about medicine. You don't know anything about money. And we were like, oh, you're right. We don't know anything about money. And he wound up going to college with somebody who had just gotten their MBA at Columbia Business School, who turned into the third founder of our company. I have shared an office with him now for 19 years. That picture, it was hard to see through the window in the small pictures, a stormtrooper who is our current head of corporate development, presenting to Batman and Robin. I was Robin, and Batman was Tarek, the guy from Columbia Business School. And we decided to embark on this idea of starting a company for technology in clinical research. I will not tell you about our funding. You've heard plenty of stories about that. I will tell you that we got ourselves funded literally right after the dot-com bubble burst. So we probably raised our first $1.5 million of capital in the worst venture market in history. But instead of telling you about that, I'll tell you about another chapter of our company after we started it, which was our IPO, which we did in 2009. Basically, the worst public market in history. We seem to, I told you, we had bad ideas. We seem to pick bad timing. Actually, it turned out to be great timing. So here we were this company that had these crazy ideas about how technology could connect people in research that used to be done, I told you about my lab bench, research in the world of pharmaceutical companies, even giant ones, until very recently, looked just like my lab bench. Paper everywhere, samples that people were tracking in weird ways. It was a total mess. We started sorting that out, and we started making our business grow. We got through this funding event. We now had a real business. We had hired somebody who actually knew something about sales, right? Because we had science, and we had medicine, and we had business, but we didn't know how to ask for money. We realized we needed to hire somebody who could ask for money. And there we are, we have this successful business. Now the internet is a thing at this point in our history. This is kind of in the mid to late 2000s. And there's probably about 50 other companies who are doing some of the things that we're doing. And the question was, how do we now differentiate ourselves from them? Well, we were signing contracts that were in the tens of millions of dollars. We had about $1 million in the bank. We were very focused on running a cash flow break-even to positive company. But as you grow your company, that means you just outgrow your balance sheet in a ridiculous way. And so that was the situation we were in. And so a chief information officer or medical officer signing a contract with Medidata couldn't really look at us and feel good about who they were signing a contract with. We had done an acquisition of a smaller company. It's really hard to do an acquisition when you have no public currency. If you're trying to use any of your equity as part of that transaction, nobody can tell you what the value is. It's like the question that was in the earlier segment. Well, what's your company worth? I don't know. That's how your company is valued when you're private. So we needed to solve for that. And we were competing against an 800-pound gorilla. It was a company from Boston. Actually, their founder is a friend of mine. I got to know him over the years. He's a great guy, but back then they were the big enemy. And I talked about kind of the high-up person on the totem pole. They turned out to be around the shin. I guess I can say now that the 800-pound gorilla was kind of like this 10-pound howler monkey. But in the world of clinical trials online, which was relatively new and small, this was the company to beat. And they were a public company. So they had this giant soapbox they could use to talk about the fact that the clinical trial market online, this idea of using the internet to connect doctors and patients and pharmas was kind of done, saturated market. It was just that we were kicking their ass in sales. But we didn't have any credibility, so we decided to have an IPO. And this is where I'm going to put a question mark on things that you've heard before. Not only do I think that one of the few reasons that we were able to reinvent our industry to the degree we have is that we were in it, and we knew what the problems were, and we knew what good looked like. But the other thing that I think I'm not sure I agree with is what seems like the idea that you should have an exit strategy. And we did our IPO because we wanted to solve for the fact that we had a balance sheet that was too thin, we had no currency we could use to make other tuck-in acquisitions, and we needed a soapbox that we could stand on and talk to a bigger part of the world about what was going on and how our industry was being reinvented. So we solved for those three things. The day after our IPO, where we had a good party, the day after our IPO, was just like every other day at Medidata for myself and for my co-founder and for all the employees. The IPO was a tool that we used to solve those problems. We had a problem to solve. What is the next step? Well, this is like designing an experiment. What is the next thing that we need to think about solving for? And we needed to solve for those things, so we did it. And we organizationally changed a lot to do that. We decided we needed somebody who understood what it was like to be in a public company and understood the IPO process from an intimate perspective. So we hired a CFO who had been through that. He tooled up an entirely different kind of finance department. And I'll tell you now, the IPO was 2009, as I said, so we're now 9 years after that. One of the other things that I've heard about year after year, I heard about it from angel investors and venture capital firms and consultants and people I met in other industries, Glenn, this is all fun. You guys can have a great time doing this, but when you have 25 employees, it's all going to be different. Oh, Glenn, this is all fun, but when you have $100 million of revenue, it's all going to be different. Oh, this is great now, but when you have your IPO, it's all serious. You're not going to have any fun anymore. It's all going to be different. And it was bullshit every single time. And I think that one of the important things for us as founders is to not set that tone, but to teach people how to keep that tone, how to keep our culture throughout what is, I hope, a long future history, which is what I'm going to tell you about next, of metadata. So we set that tone, and if you've ever worked in a hospital, it's kind of irreverent. Why? Not because treating patients isn't serious, important business. It is. It's irreverent because it's so serious that the only way I think psychologically most people can deal with that is to get dressed up on Halloween or to say fuck in town halls, which I do a lot. And we really decided that even though we were transforming the organization in ways that were related to financial capabilities, we could still be true to our life sciences roots. Our company's mission is to create smarter treatments and healthier people. It has been that way since day one and will be that way. I think you could ask any of our now 2,200 employees. It will be that way certainly on all of their watches, including mine. So how are we doing that moving forward, and where's the transformation for us now? Well, I bet that there's a lot of companies that are going to be conceived by people in this room. I know there's presentations that have been by and will be by people who think about data and analytics. And that is exactly what we're doing now. Now, I have a really interesting seat. I have been the president and founder of a company that has screwed up a data and analytics strategy. I am an executive sponsor of relationships amongst what is literally 1,000 different life sciences companies of every single size, from the largest pharma companies in the world to the smallest startup biotechs. And I've seen how in a big percentage, I won't say 1,000 out of 1,000, but how they have screwed up their data and analytics strategies. And what I will share with you is I think that people get seduced by two different things. One, we had a head of engineering at one point who felt this way. One way is that you just get obsessed with amassing data. Let's just co-locate data. And once we've got it all in one place, we'll be able to figure anything out. Once you've co-located data, that doesn't mean it's fit for purpose to do anything with. It takes a lot of time, money, energy, discipline, just gumption, sometimes hands on keyboards, to get your data in a state that you can do a responsible analysis with it. The other side that people mess up, ourselves included, we had a chief data officer who was really obsessed with words like cognitive and machine learning. By the way, these words mean something. They're real. It's not like the algorithms aren't real, but computer science has this adage of garbage in, garbage out. Cognitive, machine learning, natural language processing, it's computer science. Garbage in, garbage out. Nothing in, nothing out. So what we realized, and now we have a chief technology officer, she understands how we need to think about what I will call the steel thread of data. And we have a chief data officer who understands what I will talk about as a steel thread. And it means, what's a steel thread? It's actually a term I learned from our head of software testing. And she was talking about this metaphor that has to do with making bridges. So what's the first thing you need to do when you want to build a bridge? You got to get a steel thread, the first steel thread, across that chasm that you are trying to span, or that river that you're trying to span. Once you get the first steel thread, it's a piece of cake to weave more and more back and forth and make it thicker and thicker and more substantive. To have a good data and analytics strategy, you need to start with having the right data, having the right team that knows how to responsibly and thoroughly make it fit for purpose so it can be paired with the right algorithm so you can connect it to the right outcome that you would not have been able to achieve without that steel thread being in place. So I'll give you this last, hopefully, a piece of proof. By the way, I put exclamation points on some things and question marks, I hope, on others. There's no reason why you should believe me. I've worked at one company my whole life. Every day is the biggest company I've ever worked at. And I'm an N of one, right? So scientifically, it would be irresponsible for you to listen to me. But metadata is about creating smarter treatments and healthier people. What is an example that we've done with this steel thread? Well, people have talked for years about the idea of